Okay, this talk is going to be on carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. Just to start off with, carbohydrates, there's a few key terms that go into this. Typically we call a carbohydrate a saccharide of some sort. So that's where these words come from. And the prefix to these words, mono, di, poly, all refer to the number of sugars that are involved. And so sugars are typically this structure here, which is the shape of a ring. Each ring might have 5 sides or 6 sides, depending on the type of ring. So for example, glucose has 6 sides, fructose has 5 sides. And those are both monosaccharides because they're composed of one sugar, and then fructose is one sugar. When you add those two together, you get a disaccharide, which is the example of sucrose here at the bottom. Sometimes we call pentoses are the ones that have a 5-carbon ring, and chitin and cellulose are both examples of some carbohydrates. Those are parts of the cell. Carbohydrates give you quick energy if they're the simple sugar format. So these are mono or disaccharides. Anything that's a complex, so polysaccharide, and especially things that are starches, are the ones that give you sustained energy over a long period of time. So this down here is an example of a starch. We have one ring plus another ring plus another ring plus another ring plus another ring, and that typically goes on and on and on, and that's what starches are. So what ends up happening is your body needs to break these apart. Once it breaks those apart, then it can use it for energy down the road. So that's why complex carbohydrates provide sustained energy. Many sugars, if you eat too many sugars, it changes into fat. So basically the reverse of this is true, where if you eat a bunch of these ring structures, and eventually over a long period of time, those will start to attach together, and then that gets stored in your body for later. So just like if you eat too much sugar, fat molecules, fat particles can start to form in your body. Carbohydrates typically follow a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1 for carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So for example, glucose is C6H12O6. Okay. Other forms of this, here's a C12H22O11. Basically, that's a 1 to 2 to 1 format. That's very typical for carbohydrates in their general number of atoms. So they have 6, generally they have 1 carbon to 2 hydrogens to 1 oxygen. And so that can be in any number. So this might be 3, 6, and 3. This might be 6, 12, and 6, but it always follows that ratio. Here's their main function in cells. That's to provide energy. Some examples: glucose, fructose, galactose. Basically anything that ends in an ose is a sugar as well. Glucose is typically called the blood sugar. It's the immediate source of energy for cell respiration. So in the case down here below, here is glucose. And if you remember our discussion from before, when glucose gets broken down, it changes into CO2 and water. Those are both things that we need to get rid of. So for example, CO2, we exhale our breath. Water, we go to the bathroom. So that's how glucose is used in our blood. In our blood sugar, it's used in all of our cells. Galactose is a sugar found in milk. Fructose is a sugar found in fruits and honey. Starches. Starches are just the long chains of sugars. So plants like excess glucose molecule, they put them in the chains, forming a starch. So typically like vegetables. Rice, wheat, and corn are all major sources of starch. Before starches can enter or leave the cells, they must be digested. That means they must be broken down, like I've drawn on the previous slide. That leads us into proteins. Proteins are the essential body functions. That's what makes our energy or our bodies work. So proteins, they're made up of amino acids. We'll talk a lot about amino acids, but serine, leucine, and histidine are 3 amino acids. proteins provide support for cells. Enzymes are part of this group. Enzymes are very important to our cell processes, which we'll see in the next week or so. Proteins help transport different things. They help defend our cells. They help defend our body. And they help produce hormones and allow us to move, motion. And so there's really 4 parts to the structure. The primary structure is the order of amino acids. And this is the one that we'll spend most of the time talking about once we get to proteins a little bit more in depth. But then these form long chains. And when those long chains begin to spiral, we call it an alpha helix. And then sometimes they form spirals more like this, what we call a beta sheet. So this is a primary structure. This is a secondary structure. When these begin to fold and form upon each other, that's called the tertiary structure. And once those fold and form upon each other, we get the quaternary structure. So again, these are just made up of the primary structure all the way back here. That is the amino acids. So the important part to take from this is that proteins are a very complex molecule that have a lot of parts to them. Proteins are usually made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. There's about 100,000 different kinds in the body. So these are all made up of what's called a monomer. So a single part, they're called subunits. There's about 20 different amino acids, and they're just strung together along and along, and we'll see how those are made later on in the year. But basically, they link together through what's called a polypeptide bond. And so when those break, the amino acids can break apart. Okay, so this is the bond linking the two together, peptide bond. So you might have an amino acid here, and then you have a bond to another amino acid. This is called a peptide bond. So here's a single amino acid. So here's an amino acid, here's an amino acid, and when they react to form, they make this little peptide bond here. Then you would have another chain where there might be another peptide bond up here, and that just continues to go on and on and on until you have your protein structure. The last part of the talk is on fats. Fats are the storage for energy in our body. So they're very large molecules, which we'll see. So here's a couple examples of them. Much larger than water or even the sugars that we saw earlier. These are long chains of carbon with hydrogen and oxygen mixed in there a little bit. So we call these, depending on the type of fat. So saturated fats have all the hydrogens in the area taking up spots on carbon. What you'll notice here is if you look at a mono unsaturated, you'll see that there's a single double bond right here. And if you look at a polyunsaturated, they have a couple of spots where there should be hydrogens here, but there's not. Okay, so they are unsaturated fatty acids. So lipids are really important in our body for several reasons. One, they are hydrophobic. Oil does not mix with water, for example. So what they do then is they insulate our cells. And many parts contribute to this: fats, oils, or waxes. But like I said, these make up our cell membrane, and they keep water into our cells or out of our cells, depending on what we need. And then the other last part about this is that steroids, and you may not think of estrogen or testosterone as being steroids, but those are also lipids. Lipids have a higher ratio of carbon and hydrogen to oxygen. So there's a lot more carbon and hydrogen in them. General functions, they store energy. They're structural components of cells, like we just talked about. And then hormones. Those three things are the big parts of lipids. Lipids also have a higher energy per gram, which we'll see when we do the exercise where you have to take home and chart out a food item. So fats are 9 calories per gram of food, whereas carbs and proteins are 4 calories per gram. Okay, that's where we'll end the talk right there. And make sure you go on and take the quiz on fats, proteins, and carbohydrates.